The topic of our sermon this morning is the book Living Buddha, Living Christ by Vietnamese Buddhist monk and famed jazz flautist Thich Nhat Hanh. I actually don't know if he plays flute. I made that part up. I really want it to be true, though. This sermon topic was chosen by Liz and Chris Lippincott, who won the right to choose a sermon this year at last year's service auction. So yes, I am very well aware that this year's service auction is happening in about an hour, and so I'm getting this in just under the wire. Some of us need deadlines. Now, in creating the outline for this sermon, I came up with three major points that I wanted to explore. So then I began writing about the first point. And when I finished my draft covering just the first point, I realized that I had 2 hours of material. So get comfortable, put your feet up. Just kidding. So look, the Lippincotts are actually going to get a bonus. They are not getting just one sermon on this book. They are going to get a sermon mini-series. And that series will then start today. And because our calendar gets a little weird in May, we will pick it back up actually in June. So I have to warn all of you that the sermon today was not written to be a standalone. It does not have that typical structure. At the end of today's sermon, you're going to feel a little destabilized, weird, and kind of icky. But I promise in a month, it will all come together in a nice, happy conclusion that will give you all the warm fuzzies in your belly. I know that's what you all come here for. So I just want you to be aware as we go into this today what's going to happen. Thich Nhat Hanh is equal parts mystic, scholar, and activist. He was born in Vietnam in 1926. He joined a Zen Buddhist monastery at age 16, but he cross-trained in multiple Buddhist traditions until he became an ordained monk in 1949. Now, in 1960, Thich Nhat Hanh came to the U.S. to study comparative religion at Princeton University, and he also lectured on Buddhism at Columbia. Thich Nhat Hanh was instrumental in convincing the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to publicly oppose the war in Vietnam. Nhat Hanh counted among his friends and acquaintances MLK, Thomas Merton, Daniel Berrigan, and many others. In the 70s, he led efforts to rescue refugees from Vietnam stuck in the Gulf of Siam. He has authored over 100 books, selling over 3 million copies in America alone. He has founded 6 monasteries, dozens of practice centers in America and Europe, in addition to over 1,000 mindfulness practice communities. At the age of 90, he currently lives in France. He is fluent in French, Chinese, Sanskrit, Pali, Japanese, and English. He is also proficient at the jazz flute. I could fill this sermon this morning simply skimming over Nhat Hanh's incredibly impressive biography. Suffice it to say, the man has truly lived. He is brilliant, he is wise, he is a world changer. With that said, he is not without his critics, which you should expect of anyone who has said so much, written so much, and done so much for so many. For example, he has been criticized for visiting his homeland back in 2005 and 2007 because it was suggested his return symbolically granted legitimacy to the oppressive government of Vietnam. He has been accused of other Buddhist scholars of intellectual dishonesty in his writings, employing tricks of language, sloppy thinking, and self-dupery. With his eminently quotable bank of aphorisms, he has been derisively called a revelatory epiphany generator. And one of Thich Nhat Hanh's former students has accused him of being manipulative, hypocritical, and even litigious. Are these accusations legitimate? Or is this simply a case of where haters gonna hate? Who can say? Perhaps it's best to always remember, though, that even as enlightened and compassionate and wise as he may be, Thich Nhat Hanh is still human. I have great respect for Thich Nhat Hanh. He is a far better man than I will ever be. But when I take a look at his teachings, I will give you this promise. If I see that the emperor is naked, I will not pretend that he is fully clothed. Of course, there's a good chance that I'm naked too. Throughout this sermon series, I will be grappling with the text of this book. And to be quite honest, there are things that I absolutely love about this book. But there are also things about this book that I absolutely do not love. In today's sermon, part 1 of the series, I'm going to be looking critically at one aspect of this book that admittedly does not sit well or easily with me. Throughout Living Buddha, Living Christ, Thich Nhat Hanh explores several topics, but the golden thread connecting them all is his attempt to find common pathways to join together the Buddhist and Christian traditions. In that regard, Living Buddha, Living Christ is a resource to help begin interfaith dialogue between certain kinds of Buddhists and certain kinds of Christians. But make no mistake, it is not the complete conversation, nor is it meant for everyone. This book is a primer for liberally minded, open-hearted Christians and Buddhists who are already predisposed to looking for points of intersection with other faith traditions. This book is designed for people of faith who already value religious diversity and inclusivity and pluralism. And for such people, this book is a treasure trove of wisdom and vocabulary and anecdotes to help de-otherize the other. But maybe not the real other. More on that later. Parenthetically, I'd like to note that as I was reading this book, I felt that perhaps one of its best unintended uses might be as a guide for Unitarian Universalists who are looking for ways to better understand and connect or reconnect with Christianity and Christians. As we know, many UUs are folks who became disillusioned with a particular form of Christianity, perhaps because of a disagreement over theology, perhaps because a particular Christian church in some way was hurtful or abusive or coercive. Whatever the case and cause, we know that many UUs have great difficulty being in relationship with Christians, and this is problematic for all of us. Because the future of our world depends on meaningful interfaith collaboration. And if we UUs cannot find authentic ways to relate to Christians, especially here in Jacksonville, Florida, we're not going to accomplish much. So one truly beautiful aspect of this book is that it offers a way for disaffected UUs to find a backdoor to understanding certain versions of Christianity through Thich Nhat Hanh's version of Buddhism. But exactly how Thich Nhat Hanh does this has certain limitations. One of the great challenges, one of the tension points between Buddhism and Christianity is the conception of God. Most schools of Christianity require a belief in God, whereas most schools of Buddhism are comparatively atheistic or at the very least agnostic. Thich Nhat Hanh's strategy in Living Buddha, Living Christ is to reframe the Christian God as a persona-less thing. It's a thing that he calls ultimate reality, or ultimate dimension, or ultimate something. In the book, Thich Nhat Hanh refers to God as an ultimate something nearly 50 times. Now, for the open-minded Buddhist, of course, this is fine. And for the open-minded Christian who already thinks of Jesus and Father God as figurative personifications, this is also fine. There are, after all, many Christians who understand God as some sort of ineffable force or first cause or process. But there are also many other Christians who see God and Jesus much more literally. And the way that Thich Nhat Hanh depersonalizes their God, Thich Nhat Hanh's language, his looseness with theology and definitions, coupled with a sometimes condescending and dismissive tone, all of that will alienate these Christians, which is a shame, because I think that the more fundamentalistically minded people, these types of people, are precisely the ones that we need to figure out how to work with most. As conservative as Jacksonville as a city is, there is a surprising amount of interfaith work going on here, and it's really good work. And UUCJ, our congregation, is an important player in much of it. There's iCare, there's One Jacks, there's the faith team of JCE, the Jacksonville Coalition for Equality. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret this morning. All the congregations represented in each of those interfaith coalitions, whether they be Catholic, Protestant, UU, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Baha'i, or Sikh, we all actually worship the same God. Now, that statement isn't as offensive and stupid as it might sound at first. There are, of course, vast differences between these faith traditions, from their respective theologies to their practices to their language and diet, you name it. But, and this is a big but, those of us who freely choose to come together to do interfaith work within one of these interfaith groups, we all tend to share the same core transcendent values, the values that make our respective gods worthy of worship in the first place. So what I'm talking about here is the God behind the gods. Yahweh, Jehovah, Jesus, Allah, Spirit of life, ultimate reality, they're all very different. Their names, faces, the way they are approached are diverse. But the God behind each of them that makes them worthy of worship, the values of love, justice, and inclusivity, is essentially identical among those of us who choose to do interfaith work with each other. And that is why we all get along with one another. We share a common core. To us, our religious differences in words, practices, diets, those differences are superficial. And because they are superficial, they are non-threatening, which allows us to explore and embrace them. But for some of us, the differences aren't superficial. And that's because some of us simply don't worship the same God behind the gods. Years ago, back when I was a left-leaning Christian, I realized that although I and fundamentalist Christians both claimed to worship a deity named Jesus Christ, in actuality, we were worshiping very different gods. How do we know who the God behind the gods is for different people? Well, here's another secret for you. Religion isn't really religion anymore. The central role that religion once played in all our lives, by and large, has been replaced. Today, religion has been replaced by politics. In America in 2017, most of us define ourselves more by our allegiance to core political and social issues than with specific religious or theological dogma. LGBTQ inclusivity, racial injustice, war, the death penalty, reproductive rights, class oppression. Our feelings about these issues are far more indicative of our personal core transcendent values and priorities than whether we self-identify as Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, or Baptist. The specific political issues that each of us are most passionate about, at the core of our respective belief systems, are a far more accurate proxy of what each of us truly worship, the God behind our gods, than our religious affiliation. If you tell me that you're Jewish or Catholic, I still frankly have no idea what God you worship. But tell me where you stand on those aforementioned so-called political issues, and I have at least a bit of a hint, a bit of an insight into many of your core values. I have a better idea of the nature of the God you truly worship. So these so-called political issues are the main reasons why many people today now choose to leave one denomination or faith tradition for another. Political issues, at their core, actually are religious and spiritual issues because everything is everything. But that's a sermon for another day. So vis-a-vis interfaith work, the real question is, how do we relate to those whose God behind the gods is truly different from our own? How do we relate to one who worships a God of power and anger and destruction and coercion and exclusion and terror? A God who creates and enforces caste systems based on race or class or gender or sexual orientation. Perhaps that is the real interfaith work we need to better understand. Dr. Eboo Patel, founder of the Interfaith Youth Corps, said the following at the 2013 UUA General Assembly. Interfaith leadership is about building relationships with people who are not only different than you in ways you like, but also in ways you don't like. Which brings us back to Living Buddha, Living Christ. Although Thich Nhat Hanh says all the right things to suggest he believes in the power of interfaith work, I believe a close analysis of his writing shows that he is mostly interested in working with people who worship the same God behind the gods, the like-minded and the like-hearted. And frankly, I don't blame him because it's so much easier. I will say that I found Thich Nhat Hanh's attitude towards religious fundamentalists, and specifically fundamentalist Christians, a little more condescending than I was comfortable with. Throughout the book, repeatedly, Thich Nhat Hanh authoritatively declares certain idiosyncratic interpretations of the words of Jesus as the, quote, true teaching of Christ. He identifies those who, quote, truly embody the Spirit, the, quote, real Christians, who, quote, authentically represent their tradition. The obvious corollary to these words is that Thich Nhat Hanh believes that there are Christian teachings and Christian believers out there who are not true, not real, not authentic representations. So, who exactly are the fake Christians with all the fake teachings, according to Thich Nhat Hanh? Well, obviously, they're the ones who don't agree with Thich Nhat Hanh's personal interpretation of the Bible, which he is obviously interpreting through his own Buddhist lens. In one section of his book, he goes so far as to argue with Pope John Paul II on a piece of Christian theology. Thich Nhat Hanh says that the Christian belief that Jesus is the sole mediator between God and humanity does not accurately reflect the mystery of the Trinity. It does not reflect Jesus' true humanity. And Thich Nhat Hanh throws away the Christian argument that Jesus was the unique Son of God by suggesting that all people are unique. He says, the notion that Christianity provides the only way of salvation and all other religious traditions are of no use. This attitude excludes dialogue and fosters religious intolerance and discrimination. It does not help. Now let me say this. I personally have great sympathy for Thich Nhat Hanh's conclusion. To be quite honest, I tend to agree with him. But when you make such a statement in a book putatively designed for bridging interfaith gaps between Christians and Buddhists, you're pretty clearly signaling that there is a large swath of Christians that you have no intention of trying to reach. To presume to correct the Pope on matters of Christology, that takes some chutzpah, so to speak. And it's not going to win you a lot of friends among Christians. Interfaith work is super easy if we simply take the teachings of other faith traditions, interpret them in the light we like best, declare those the true and genuine teachings of that faith. And in this book, Thich Nhat Hanh essentially turns Jesus into a Buddha, and then turns Siddhartha into a Christ. I understand the desire to want to do this, and there is a lot of overlap between the teachings. But gosh, it's a dangerous game. Amputating the parts of a faith tradition we don't like, sanding down the rough edges, renaming and reframing it on behalf of those who practice that faith, that's not interfaith work. It's a form of colonialism. Ironically, not unlike what Catholic Christian missionaries did to Vietnamese Buddhists centuries ago. Another irony, throughout the book, Thich Nhat Hanh repeatedly attacks, in the abstract, fundamentalism, or the idea that one side has a monopoly on truth. But I have trouble understanding how he can say that when he repeatedly makes declaratory statements about the so-called true teachings of a faith tradition that isn't even his own. A question I have is, who exactly gets to decide whether or not a person is serving their faith correctly? I think this is an incredibly complex and difficult question. For example, I personally don't like the way that many schools of Islam discriminate against LGBTQ people. Do I get to tell these Muslims that they're doing Islam wrong, even if I can find a Muslim scholar willing to co-sign my statement? This is a dangerous game. If I simply get to erase all the problems I have with the beliefs of a certain faith tradition, then marginalize those who adhere to those beliefs as part of a radical fringe, it sure makes it easier to do interfaith work because it removes all potential for conflict. And that's kind of what Thich Nhat Hanh wants. He writes, "We must glean the best values of all traditions and work together to remove the tensions between traditions in order to give peace a chance." This was a red flag statement for me. How exactly does Thich Nhat Hanh propose that we remove the tensions? Tension is necessary if we ever hope to learn or be moved or be changed. Learning only happens when we are exposed to something different or new or novel. But if I take the different or new or novel and immediately convert it to what is familiar and already accepted, then there is no opportunity for learning because there is no opportunity for dialogue. The Reverend Dr. King talked about the need for creative tension in his letter from Birmingham jail. In music, it is the tension between the ends of a string that allow for the playing of different tones. Sometimes tension doesn't feel good, but dear God, we need it, don't we? So I, for one, absolutely believe in the value of tension. Unless, of course, I am absolutely wrong, which I may be. And maybe Thich Nhat Hanh is absolutely right. Maybe we should get rid of religious tensions because as a species, we have proven over and over again that we are incapable of peace so long as such tensions exist. Maybe pluralism, and I mean real pluralism, not superficial pluralism in which we celebrate only the differences we like. Maybe we have to be honest with ourselves that real pluralism truly is a fantasy. As an experiment, it has always resulted in failure. And by failure, I mean like the enslavement of entire peoples, mass segregation, and genocide. Maybe Thich Nhat Hanh is right that there is one fundamental truth, and that is that we absolutely cannot accept fundamentalism, that we ought never tolerate intolerance, and any faith tradition or culture that perpetuates intolerance is simply wrong, less evolved, or at the very least a threat to lasting peace. And if the great end of humanity is peace, then it behooves people of conscience from every faith tradition to reform and reshape their traditions until all our core values match, until the God behind all our gods is one and the same, to work tirelessly until our side, the side of love and inclusivity and tolerance and justice and truth until our side wins by defeating the other side. Now, Thich Nhat Hanh never uses that kind of language in Living Buddha, Living Christ. In fact, he claims the opposite. He writes, "When we take sides, we misunderstand the will of God." But of course, by saying this, he has created two sides: those who take sides and those who don't. Moreover, he claims that one of those sides is with God and the other side is not. So what he's actually suggesting then is that we gather all the side takers, the religious fundamentalists, those who otherize, and make them into the last other. And then what? What do we do with them? As far as I can tell from the text of this book, he is either suggesting non-engagement or conversion. Now, it's all very compassionate, with very nice flowery language, but it is still a form of religious conversion. He wants the other to become awakened, enlightened, born again. He is suggesting a proselytization of unbelievers through the tools of meditation and mindfulness, not proselytizing them to necessarily become either Buddhist or Christian, but proselytizing them into the creedless interfaith fellowship of those who accept everyone and everything, except for those who don't accept everyone and everything. His vision is a compassionate coaxing of all people into this beautiful interfaith hive of love and diversity and acceptance, where we all worship the same God behind the gods, the same ultimate reality behind our realities. In other words, religious assimilation. Resistance is futile. I think Thich Nhat Hanh is brilliant. I think he is a beautiful soul, and I think that he is a holy man. I think I would love to call him teacher and be his student. I think he's right, and I think he's wrong. I think I'm right, and I think I'm wrong. I think I need to keep thinking about all this. I also think sometimes we all need to stop thinking. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh would agree. I think, like Paul McCartney once suggested, love truly is all we need. But I think love is far more complicated than most of us want to admit. And I think that I am ever so grateful to be part of a community where we can put our hearts and minds together in order to determine what the path of love really looks like and what it requires of each of us. Blessed be.